Hey guys, welcome back to another video. So today's learner driver got 0 minor faults at Wanstead Driving Test Centre. I would recommend everyone to watch this video and to see how the learner got 0 minor faults on their driving test. For those of you that are interested in having a mock test in a safe and supportive environment, or for any other inquiries, please message me. My contact details are on the screen above. So as you can see, there's a compulsory left sign here. Now, in terms of signals, how your signals are marked on your driving test are they necessary, correctly and timed? Now, when the road is a compulsory left, you have to ask yourself the question, would a signal be beneficial to anyone in this scenario? That's how you always want to ask yourself in terms of signals. Even at designated lanes where you've got a left turn or a right turn only, you don't need to signal. However, if you feel like someone can benefit from it, like pedestrians, then obviously you should go ahead and signal. That's how you're showcasing your awareness and planning to the driving examiner. Typically, I tend to find on this road there tends to be a lot of meeting situations. So whenever you're on a road where both cars cannot fit simultaneously, cannot pass one another, shall we say, then guys, you need to be planning for meeting situations and scanning for good gaps to hold back within. Now, shortly after the pupil went out of Nightingale Lane, the examiner then instructed my pupil to pull over on the left before the next parked vehicle and keep a car length gap. So this, when the examiner addresses that, is called an angled start. So if you are driving a manual transmission vehicle, whenever you do an angled start, be mindful that you don't want to move away with too much speed, because it may be difficult to maneuver around the parked car due to the limited space. So you want to have, like, essentially the key factors to consider here are having a slow car. So you want to control your speed of the car with a clutch pedal, and to obviously have a good level of steering, sufficient amount of steering to avoid getting any clearance faults on the angled start. The pupil was then instructed to obviously drive on when they're ready. Now, another thing to consider here is that you are on uphill gradients, so essentially they are also getting a hill start in. Now, when the pupil does drive on here, if you can acknowledge from the video, the road bends to the right. So as a candidate now, a test pupil candidate, you should be asking yourself the question, what could be coming towards us? As you can see here, cars could be driving towards us on the bend. So whenever the road bends to the right, you need to ask yourself the question, how can I position to better my visibility and reduce the chances of going into the oncoming cars? Also, when you're emerging from a T-junction, how can we assess that there's a safe opportunity to seize? First and foremost, you should be using the LADA routine, which stands for Look, Assess, Decide and Act. But for those of you that are watching this, can you comment to me in the comment section below? How have you been taught to utilize or seize an opportunity at a junction? How can you acknowledge if it's safe for you to go at a junction, even if there is a car driving towards us in the distance? What sort of rule of thumb could we use to gauge if it's safe to go or not?